Thank you, Mr. President. And I just want to echo what Dr. Burke said just a few short months ago. I was one of those doctors on the front lines, and I know how terrific they're working and how well they're doing for the American people. And a shout out to them for just the wonderful work that they do every day. So President Trump asked the FDA to remove all unnecessary barriers that were in place to help with the development of both diagnostics and therapeutics, and we have done that. I'm here to give you an update on FDA's efforts around serologic tests, which, as you know, are antibody tests, which detect in the blood the natural immunity that someone might develop in response to an infection, in this case, COVID-19. These aren't diagnostic tests, but these are tests that actually detect the antibody, so an indication that one has had the infection and has responded. And I think it's important for everyone to understand that the timing of the response of the antibody to the infection isn't completely known, but we know that it takes some time to actually develop that. And there's two types of antibody responses that can be detected. And the antibody tests are just one piece of the larger response that you've heard in the America Returning to Work plan that the President has, with the task force, has developed. And this pandemic is truly unprecedented in nature, and you'll see reports around the world of different antibody tests that have been used. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that we're just learning and beginning to understand what that response looks like. And many of these tests have different characteristics that allow to detect at different points in the infection. I do want to address one issue that we are laser focused on at FDA, and that is in an effort to provide laboratories and healthcare providers the early access to tests. We issued a policy earlier in March that allowed test developers the opportunity to quickly get their tests to market and address the needs of the nation as posed by the epidemic. In March, we provided this regulatory flexibility to manufacturers, and here's what we required of them. The manufacturers had to validate their tests. We call it self-validation, similar to what many test developers in the world have done. They had to notify FDA that they had performed that validation. And then they had to label their products appropriately in the package insert with information about the validation, as well as the fact that it's not a diagnostic test, that it's an antibody test. And the bottom line here is that FDA still expects manufacturers and test developers to validate their antibody tests even under this revised policy. Now, we've done a couple of things to actually help end users, to help laboratories, providers, et cetera, states in terms of their use of these antibody tests. One is that we're working with CDC and NCI to actually validate some of the more than 90 manufacturers who've notified us that they brought their test to market, to do an independent validation. And that process is going. We expect to hear more information this week about that, and we will provide that information in a transparent manner. We also want to go after anyone who is saying that the test has been authorized or has been approved by the FDA, but actually hasn't. And we've authorized 4 applications for antibody tests, and 140 test developers are pursuing applications for us as we speak. So it's not okay for someone to say that a test's been authorized or approved by FDA when it hasn't, and we are pursuing them both by in direct contact with the manufacturers, but also at the border. And so we have increased these interdiction efforts, and we will continue to outreach and do that with the manufacturers to make sure that we provide the most up-to-date information to the end users of these products. And we will continue to make all of our efforts, both in the diagnostics and the therapeutics, to help America open up again. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Hahn?
Go ahead.
Dr. Hahn, you're speaking of 140 different developers, more than 90 manufacturers. How many of these tests actually work?
So as I mentioned, the 90 that have come forward and said they're marketing in the U.S., they are required by us to have self-validation, and they're required to label that appropriately in their package insert. And they also said that what we're doing is we're working with folks around the country, but here at home at the U.S. government with the NCI and CDC to validate some of those tests that have come forward to us. So we're actually doing some independent validation.
What have you found so far?
So we don't have those results yet. I expect to have more results this week, but we will be transparent about those results because I think it's very important. And your question is superb in that if someone wants to use a test that's come to market, really, it's important to read the information that's in the package insert, but often in some of those cases, it's also important for the independent labs to do the validation also. And you may have seen reports in the press of labs around the country that have done that. We've actually reached out to them, many academics, and we will be including that information in the information that we generate as well to provide to the American people.
Dr. Hahn?
Well, we have you here. There was a study out of the VA today on hydroxychloroquine that found a higher mortality rate compared to those who got standard of care. And I know this isn't a large-scale clinical trial, but since this drug is out there and people are using it, can you give some takeaways from that study? Did that change your thinking at all on the hydroxychloroquine?
So this study is a small retrospective study at the VA, and similar to the data we talked about before with the French study, this is something that a doctor would need to consider as part of a decision in writing a prescription for hydroxychloroquine. And as I've mentioned from this podium and in other venues before, what FDA is going to require is data from clinical trials, randomized clinical trials, hydroxychloroquine placebo, to actually make a definitive decision around safety and efficacy. But the preliminary data are helpful to providers. And doctors, I want to ask them to incorporate the data as we have it come forward. And it's not definitive data. It doesn't help us make a decision from a regulatory point of view. But doctors should incorporate that in the decision making they make on a one-on-one basis.
And just the timeline on the clinical trials and when we will be getting a readout of that data?
So the good news is we have over 30 clinical trials. Now the settings are very different. They're in the outpatient setting, they're in the inpatient setting, and also I think very importantly in what we call the post-exposure prophylaxis, meaning if you're a healthcare worker or a frontline provider and you've been exposed to the virus, take the drug for a period of time to see if you can prevent the development of illness related to the virus. So all those trials are in progress and will probably be early summer before we get a readout.
And Mr. President, if I can pick up on that.